see you on Facebook now.
All right, excellent.
Yeah. All right.
All right, welcome everybody. This is Mark Malloy with Emerging Revolutionary War. We're coming to you live tonight, bringing you with Jeremiah DeGennaro from Alamance Battleground in North Carolina. I'm actually traveling this weekend myself. I'm in Nashville, named after somebody who actually played a part in the events of Alamance back in 1771. But so Alamance is a part of the early American history. We're coming up in a couple weeks on the 250th anniversary of the Battle of Alamance, which happened in May of 1771, and is very much tied to a lot of that early American history with the Revolutionary War. Some actually claim it as the first battle of the Revolution, which I think we'll get into whether that's a proper moniker or not. But we got Jeremiah here to fill us in a little bit about what happened at Alamance back in 1771, and it's actually part of its own sort of separate history called the War of Regulation. So some of our viewers may not be very familiar with what the War of Regulation is. So I'll go ahead and turn it over to you, Jeremiah, if you want to fill us in a little bit about some of the background of how essentially, which was a almost like a civil war between North Carolinians that broke out there. So what was the regulator movement and what became the War of Regulation?
Yeah, thanks, Mark. And yeah, you put it pretty well when you describe it as a civil war, because it is a battle that is fought between two separate factions of North Carolinians, and it is sometimes referred to as War of Regulation. And when people first hear about that, if they hear that phrase, they think, what is this war that I didn't hear about in history class? At least if you're not from North Carolina. So this is the Battle of Alamance is the culminating event in the regulator movement, which is a social protest movement in the backcountry of North Carolina, starting in the 1760s, going into the early 1770s. And in this movement, you had small farmers who were protesting against what they saw as corruption among local officials. The issues that they were talking about were very, very local. The problems that they had were with local people rather than with even the royal governor, really, or with King George III. We're talking about like judges, clerks of court, the register of deeds, the sheriffs at the county level. These farmers have issues with things like extortion. They mention taxation, which often comes up when you're talking about the Revolutionary War, of course, but with taxation, what the regulators were really protesting against was unfair taxation or regressive taxation. They really had a problem with the poorest farmer paying the same amount of money as the wealthiest land speculator. And so all of these different elements of economic inequality and corruption that were just rife throughout the backcountry in North Carolina, and specifically in a couple places in Orange County, which is kind of between Greensboro and like the Durham, Raleigh area, to give our out-of-state viewers kind of an idea of the area we're talking about, and then Rowan County, which is north of the Charlotte area. It's within that corridor that you see a lot of these farmers that begin protesting. They do something that's very common throughout American history. They organize, and it's a peaceful movement when it starts, and they organize as a petition movement. They start asking nicely for things to change, and those petitions are sent to local officials, and nothing really happens. And then once those petitions get ignored, then the farmers become increasingly frustrated, increasingly angry, and bit by bit, you see these small elements or pockets of targeted violence, not just wanton violence or destruction, but very targeted violence against these officials that they're complaining about. And once that violence breaks out, then the local officials and the royal governor, they have the excuse to respond in kind with violence. And in backcountry North Carolina, we see this escalation that continues for a period of about 2 or 3 years. It really reaches a fever pitch in September of 1770 when the regulators have a riot in the town of Hillsborough, which was the county seat for Orange County. It still is, actually. And they go into the courthouse when Superior Court is in session. They take the officials from the courthouse, drag them down the steps, and they beat them up in the street. Once that happens, the governor, his name's William Tryon, he realizes he's lost complete control of the backcountry. He raises a militia through the winter of 1770 and 71. And in late April, around this time, 250 years ago, his force was marching west into the backcountry, headed toward these areas that were under the control of these regulators. And on May 16th, 1771, they fight this battle. And when the battle took place, there were about 3,000 people engaged. There were 8 artillery pieces. There was light horse, there were rangers as part of the militia of Governor Tryon. And so this really was a very significant military engagement that resulted in scores of people killed and wounded. And for this one brief, intense moment, North Carolina is sort of at war with itself. Now, of course, the regulators lose this battle. And because of that, the regulator movement is crushed, and it restores some sense of order to North Carolina. But one of the things that we talk about at Alamance Battleground is how the tensions that exist in North Carolina in the late 1760s and early 1770s get reopened. Those tensions and those divisions are reopened in 1775 and 1776 when the Revolutionary War does come. Now, because of its proximity to the Revolutionary War, some people to figure out how the Battle of Alamance relates to the Revolutionary War. And I can say that there's not a satisfying answer. There's not really a clean explanation that shows that the regulator movement or the Battle of Alamance are part of the Revolutionary War. But it is a very interesting and very significant moment in its own right. We can get into that a little bit more, but yeah, it's important to give some context to this, because at the time, this was a historical event that a lot of people throughout the country were keeping their eyes on, they were aware of. But once the Revolutionary War came, then that just, much bigger conflict really overshadowed the regulator movement and the Battle of Alamance. And we're left trying to figure out what it was exactly that happened.
Yeah, no, I think that's really fascinating because, yeah, many of the participants that are going to be involved at Alamance will also take, will play roles during the revolution as well. So
right, yeah, it's not to say that they don't get involved in the revolution, but an interesting thing happens, and the sides kind of get jumbled up. I won't say that the sides switch, because the regulators, which a lot of people would think, as the ones who are like bucking authority and are protesting, they're rebelling, that they would join the rebellious side during the Revolutionary War. Well, a lot of the regulators become loyalists. And likewise, a lot of the militia, who, in the 19th century, they're being portrayed as like British redcoats. They're referred to as the British Army. But really, you look at the list of officers who were in Tryon's militia, and you've got Richard Caswell, who's North Carolina's first revolutionary governor. You have Francis Nash, who is a Continental Army officer. The artillery that's just raking the regulator position with grape shot, that's under the command of James Moore, who goes on again to be an officer in the Continental Army. And so you have this very weird switch of sides, really a jumbling, where everybody just kind of gets shuffled around.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting because, yeah, when you're talking about the causes that kind of led to this, and I mean, just the very word regulator, I think, is interesting. So they were seeking, better regulation of the colonial government, but within the confines of the overall royal government. So they're not looking to break away per se, but they're just looking for better regulation of that that colonial government. So that's kind of interesting. And you're right, it's kind of interesting to see. Now, could you tell us a little bit about the I guess one of the leaders of the regulators was Herman Husband, correct?
Yes.
Because I find him pretty interesting, in that and the connection, maybe not even as much with the revolution, but then with the whiskey rebellion that happens in the 1790s, which I think is kind of interesting.
Right.
There as well.
Yeah. And he's a good example of one of those regulators who does become a, quote unquote revolutionary, but he just has a very revolutionary spirit. So Herman Husband he's the thought leader of the regulators. He's the pamphleteer. He's the one who does most of the writing. And he is an interesting character because he's got a sort of naturally dissenting, I don't want to say disagreeable exactly, but he does not shy away from a fight. So he is born to an Anglican family, and during the Great Awakening, he becomes a Quaker. And when he moves down to North Carolina, he gets involved with the Cane Creek Friends meeting, which is right in the heart of what's going to be the regulator movement. And when he's in Cane Creek, he gets involved in a very ugly fight within the Friends meeting called the Rachel Wright Affair that centers around around this instance of women within the Friends meeting, one of which had accused another member of the meeting of rape. And Herman Husband puts himself sort of in opposition to these women. And so from a very early age during his time in North Carolina, he finds himself kind of building up supporters on one side, but always finding himself at odds with others. And in the 1760s, he is helping to lead this regulator movement and becomes a pretty prominent figure. He gets elected to the assembly off of the strength of his support within the regulator community. And his involvement is, it's so central to the regulator that when Governor Tryon is trying to put out an amnesty for regulators who will sign an oath of allegiance, Herman Husband is one of the few leaders who is accepted from that amnesty. And more to the point, there's a piece of legislation known as the Johnston Riot Act, which names Herman Husband as one of the leaders and says that if he is apprehended, he can be taken dead or alive, and a reward would be given. His property can be confiscated by the colonial government. And so at the battle, we think that Herman Husband was there, at least for the first part of the battle. But then once it became clear that this was going to be a shooting war and blood was going to be shed, Herman Husband leaves. He gets out of North Carolina because he knows if he gets captured, he's going to get strung up. And so he goes first to Maryland, and then on to Pennsylvania. And he settles in Western Pennsylvania, kind of around the area closer to Pittsburgh. And while he's there, he gets involved in the Revolution. And then in the 1790s, he becomes a leader within the Whiskey Rebellion. And it's a movement that bears a lot of similarities to the North Carolina regulation. I wouldn't say it's exactly the same thing. And Herman Husband isn't the leader in the way that he was during the regulator movement, but he is one of the important leaders of the Whiskey Rebellion. And while we're talking about tackling this myth of Alamance as the first battle of the Revolution, it's good to look to the Whiskey Rebellion as something that is post-revolutionary, as an example of what kind of issues the regulators were upset about. And it helps us to draw more parallels with that historical moment than it does with the Revolutionary War.
Yeah, I think one of the things that really pops out at me reading and learning about the Battle of Alamance is this I feel like in American history, there's always such a focus on the divisions between North and South that,
Mhm.
ultimately end up with the Civil War. But then you have, these real tensions between East and West that, date back to the earliest parts of the country. And there is always this kind of tension between the two sides. And I think this is a good example of that. So.
Absolutely. Yeah. I sort of gave context for the geographical areas of the regulator movement. Then, if you look at a map from the Battle of Alamance that includes a company by company breakdown of Tryon's militia, uh, you see Craven County, which is New Bern, coastal, Carteret, coastal, New Hanover, that's Wilmington. And so you have these eastern counties that are answering the call and they're marching west. Now, the largest contingent of Tryon's militia is Orange County. That's the exact same area that the regulators are from, but everybody else are mostly coming from the eastern counties, and demographically, they're very different. North Carolina, it does not have a homogenous population by any means. The coastal plain of North Carolina and those eastern counties where they're there, it's very English, it's very Anglican. But then once you get into the backcountry, into the foothills, where you have access to the Great Wagon Road and immigration from Pennsylvania, from Virginia, you have more Germans, you have Scots-Irish Presbyterians, you've got all of these naturally dissenting groups. Your Presbyterians, your German Pietists and Lutherans, you've got Quakers, of course, and then within that North Carolina backcountry, there is this huge, constantly growing Baptist movement that is happening almost at the same time. And so you have a population in the backcountry that looks incredibly different from the very English establishment of the East.
Yeah, and yes, I mean you mentioned him a few times, but Tryon, is he? Who is he, and is he as
Mhm.
bad as they were painting him as, or has been painted in history
Yeah,
books?
with our interpretation, we try not to go all in on determining who are the good guys and who are the bad guys. Because there's a lot that Tryon does that shows that he's in a tough position, and he's at least smart. You can't say that he is particularly kind, but he's very smart and he knows how to play politics. He also has a very smart military mind. So, to give a little bit of background, William Tryon had come in the early to mid 1760s. First, he was the lieutenant governor under Arthur Dobbs, and then after Dobbs passed away, then he gets elevated to governor. The capital, which had been in Brunswick Town, closer to Wilmington, that gets moved, and he moves it to New Bern. And when he moves the government to New Bern, he calls for a new government structure, levies a tax to pay for it, and that comes to be known as Tryon's Palace. So, very early on, he finds himself sort of at odds with both the backcountry, and then remember, as he's being elevated to the governorship, the Stamp Act is happening. There's intense, disagreement among the Eastern elite about things that we're more comfortable discussing within that Revolutionary War framework. And being a colonial governor at the time was very, very difficult because he had pressure from above him, coming from England and his superior, Lord Hillsborough. And then he also had an immense amount of pressure from the movers and shakers of North Carolina who controlled the assembly. And they control the ability to pass laws. They control the purse strings to a certain extent of how money is going to be spent. And he has to sort of play both sides. And so when he is faced with this uprising in the backcountry that is attacking like the most wealthy and powerful people in North Carolina. He chooses the wealthy and powerful North Carolinians. And we can Monday morning quarterback that a little bit and talk about the ways in which he probably should have tried to make some concessions to the regulators. But there are a lot of things that were sort of beyond his control, and should really be laid at the hands of some of the local officials that really made the regulators upset. One good example is Edmund Fanning, who was a friend of Governor Tryon's, but he's a local official in Orange County. He's an official of the court. He's a register of deeds for a while. He sits in the assembly. He just is a holder of all of these different offices, and he uses every single one to his advantage. And one document from the regulator movement says that the regulation in Orange County would not have been as strong if it were not for Edmund Fanning. It's a lot of it is personality driven.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, Tryon was in a tough spot.
Mm-hmm. And he determines, in 1771 that he's going to need to, call out the whole militia and march them out to. Now, are the regulators are gathering there in Orange County, or are they, are they already kind of been in that location? So
yeah, so by 1771, the regulator movement is incredibly popular, to the point that they are able to marshal thousands of people in different spots to achieve different goals. So an example of this is in late April and early May of 71. As before the battle, but as this military campaign is progressing, Governor Tryon sends an officer, Hugh Waddell, who had been an officer of provincial troops during the French and Indian War. Sends Waddell to Salisbury, which is kind of near Charlotte, to raise some militia from Rowan, from Mecklenburg, and to move east while Tryon moves west, and then the two armies would connect, form a big army that would fight against the regulators. So Waddell raises, what he can, not much beyond like 200 troops, because the regulation is so strong in that area. But he gets to the largest river in the area, the Yadkin, and as he is getting close to crossing the Yadkin, he is stopped by about 2,000 regulators. And it is not going to be a fair fight. If he tries to use force, he's not going to win. And so Waddell retreats. So that's a great example where the regulators just have this mass to their movement, and they've got all these people that they can move around, because only about a week after that happens, you have, again, about 2,000 people who are at Alamance Battleground in a completely different part of the state. So not everybody that blocked Waddell at the Yadkin are going to be at Alamance. You've got mostly Orange County regulators that are going to be there for that. But, up until May 16th, the what's the word I'm looking for? The outcome of the military campaign is very much in doubt. And the regulators aren't necessarily trying to beat Tryon in a military confrontation. What they're trying to do is, through the force of their numbers, compel Tryon to meet with them and to make some concessions for them. Now they make a gamble there, thinking that he is not going to fire into a crowd of 2,000 people. They're wrong. He was ready to do that, but that was sort of the extent of the regulators' I guess plan. Their strategy against Governor Tryon, and based on the difficulties that they had, no military structure, no officers. They were not looking at this as a military campaign. They did the best they could with what they had, but ultimately they end up bringing a knife to a gunfight, as it were. And William Tryon has every intent of using the force that he has put together to put down the regulation.
Yeah, and so so they march out there. Yeah, you say you got 2,000 regulators. Tryon has how many? About 1,000 men?
Yeah,
Or?
he's got about 1,000 troops, and that is including his 8 artillery pieces. He had, before the campaign began, he had written to Thomas Gage in New York asking for a bunch of material of war and for artillery specifically. And Gage sends 2 3-pound field pieces. So he takes those are his big guns. He takes the 3-pound field pieces and he puts them on either side of his lines. Of course, this is 18th century. It's all very linear. He's got one long straight line for his front line and then a rear second line that's also one long straight line. So his 3-pounders are protecting his flanks because he's worried about the regulators getting around his flank because they have so many people. And then he also invents a sort of artillery piece, and he takes swivel guns from the ramparts of a fort on the coast and has them mounted onto carriages. So he does not have enough field artillery, but he sees these guns. A half-pound swivel gun will fire a solid shot about the size of a golf ball, and he mounts those onto carriages, and he puts those 6 swivel guns right in the center of his first line. So that's kind of bolstering the militia. These are volunteers. They've had some time to drill, but they're nowhere near the professional soldiers that like the British Army would have. But that's the size of his force, and that's what he brings to bear at Alamance. And he actually, about a half mile before getting onto the battlefield, he orders his army from column of march into their battle lines, and they march forward in those straight lines to try to look as big and intimidating as possible.
And no redcoats, correct? No.
Well, not a red coat in sight among the enlisted men, among the officers. We do sometimes interpret Governor Tryon wearing a regimental coat or an officer's uniform because at the time he did have a commission in the 1st Regiment Foot Guards. So he did have some military experience. He had the clothing, possibly. And so we do interpret it that way. But otherwise, no, the 19th century depictions of the battle that show everybody in redcoats, it's just not realistic. North Carolina did not have the money. This was an emergency military campaign that was put together to crush what was being called an insurgency. And so, they weren't going to have uniforms made for it. The most uniform thing that they had were cockades that they had put into their hats. We think they might have been yellow, but the documentation on that is a little bit scant. They also were issued black leggings, so that's another uniform item that anyone in the militia would have had. But otherwise, it's just people wearing, like clothing is as different as what you and I are wearing right now.
Mm-hmm. And then the combat itself, how does it play out? How long do they even fight? Do the regulators put up much resistance, or how did it play out?
They definitely put up resistance from the get-go. The regulators are very resistant to what's going on. So the militia arrives on the battlefield a little bit before noon on May 16th. And one of the things that Governor Tryon has to do is he has to read this legislation. And I referred to it back as the Johnston Riot Act. And you may have heard of that expression, reading the Riot Act to someone. That is an actual part of English law where you can create a piece of legislation that says that someone is in unlawful assembly. And you can then read that piece of legislation to them and tell them that if they do not disperse, then force can be used against them. In the case of the Johnston Riot Act, it's deadly force. They are authorized to use deadly force against the regulators. So they get to the battlefield. Tryon sends the sheriff of Orange County out to these different groups of the 2,000 regulators that are there on the battlefield to read the Riot Act. And, several minutes later, they come back. They said, we tried reading it to like 6 different groups of people. And every single time they said, battle, battle. They were shouting, "Fire and be damned." They said they want to fight. And so they get shouted down. They come back. The militia still stays there for a little bit because the time that is meant to elapse from reading the riot act to when the crowd is supposed to disperse is about an hour. You're supposed to give the crowd an hour. Okay, so they're sitting there, and there is a letter that was written almost immediately after the battle that says, regulators were coming up in groups. They were getting within 10 yards of the militia, and they were, opening up their shirts and saying, you're here. If you want to fire, go ahead and fire on us now. They're trying to egg on the battle. And some of those regulators they had swords and cuttos, and they said that they were hacking away at militia, like trying to start the battle. And those guys they get captured. Some of them get killed in the course of that like early hand-to-hand fighting. And eventually Tryon just says, okay, obviously this group is not going to disperse. So he orders his artillery to fire. There are a couple of versions of what happens at the outset of the battle, but the ones that are the most detailed are from about 50 years after. So you got to take them with a really big grain of salt. So we don't know a whole lot about like the cause of like that spark that causes Tryon to go ahead and order the artillery to fire, and then the regulators firing back. But once the firing starts, then the regulators who are in a wooded area, it's not they're not out on like open farmland at the time. They get down on the ground, they get behind trees. There are a few rocks that they can take cover behind, and so Governor Tryon's report says that they take to bush fighting, and they stay there for 45 minutes, which is a long time to be sitting on a battlefield in the 18th century. But a few things happen. Of course, not all of the regulators who arrive on the battlefield are armed. So if you don't have a gun, you're pretty naked out there. So you're going to leave the battlefield. A lot of the regulators are actually Quakers. I mentioned some of those dissenting groups that are there in the backcountry. So again, Quakers are not going to take part in a battle. And then, of course, you have killed and wounded. So at the end of that 45 minutes, that regulator force, which had a numerical advantage, it gets worn down to the point that the odds are a little bit more even. And so after 45 minutes, Governor Tryon orders his first and second lines of militia forward, and they go up and over the hillside that the regulators had been occupying, go over through their camp, and then they continue to chase the regulators for another quarter mile and disperse the crowd, I guess in a way that they weren't able to with the Riot Act.
Wow. And then, what happened, I know there were some people hanged as a result of this. Can you talk a little bit about what happened there?
Absolutely. So after the battle, the day after, there is one execution that takes place, a regulator named James Few. We don't know a whole lot of why it's him that gets executed. He's hanged back at the militia's camp the day after the battle. But the reports and the orderly books from Governor Tryon say that it was at the behest of the militia, that they were just so furious at having had to fight this battle. They've lost, they had lost 9 killed and 61 wounded at the end of this battle. And so I think a lot of those militiamen who had not been anticipating bloodshed were especially upset at the regulators. And so you have James Few, who is hanged, and then you have scores of regulators, as many as 40, who are captured and stay with the militia while Governor Tryon undertakes a punitive march. So he leaves his camp near Alamance Creek on, I think it's either May 18th or 19th, and begins marching. Rather than marching east back home, he marches west, and he goes to find the homes of regulator leaders, hoping to capture some of those leaders, like Herman Husband, another one named James Hunter, also Redknapp Howell. They're all in the general area, and he's going after them. And then he's really just trying to make his presence known in the backcountry and puts out that offer of amnesty to anyone who takes an oath of allegiance, anyone who promises to surrender up their arms, promise not to take up arms against the government again, pay any outstanding taxes that they might owe. And that continues on for about 3 weeks, going through the backcountry. He's also levying requisitions for food from the local communities. So he's subsisting on the land, and it's done partially to subsist his army, but then also part of it is slightly punitive. And during that time, he is really trying to restore order and really snuff out any activity that the regulators might have. After June 19th, when he arrives in Hillsborough and hangs 6 more regulator leaders after a trial for treason, then he goes back home. Though he doesn't actually stay in North Carolina for very long, because before this whole campaign started, he had received word that he'd been promoted to the governorship of New York. And so after all of this happens, then he goes back to New Bern, hops on a boat, takes that up to New York, and goes on to bigger things, while the rest of the colony sort of picks up the pieces.
Yeah, so does that snuff out all this this desire to do to
It's pretty effective. You don't really hear much about the regulators after June 19th. Of course, all the leaders have left. They hang out in Virginia or Maryland. Herman Husband, runs and keeps on running. There's only one leader who does not get captured. He comes back down to what is now Guilford County. That's James Hunter. And Hunter is, I like to give him a shout out because he is I see him as he's the guy who can win people to the cause. He's the influencer, if you will. And so he's incredibly popular. After the battle, you have this petition with all these signatures from people that are trying to get a pardon for James Hunter. And he deserves some credit because he's one of the only regulator leaders who's able to stay in North Carolina without anything happening to him, just because he's kind of got this protection around him from this community that really loves him. And he's also an interesting character because when the revolution does come, I know some people try to meet with him, trying to kind of curry his favor, because you curry favor with James Hunter, you can curry favor with part of the backcountry. But in 76, he is one of the loyalists who gets captured at Moores Creek. And so when the Revolutionary War does come, he's one of those regulator loyalists that we like to talk about.
Yeah, I guess could you talk a little bit about that? Why were these? Why did so many regulators, I guess, decide to join the Loyalists?
Yeah,
when the war broke out?
I think a lot of it has to do with that experience at the Battle of Alamance and seeing the Orange County Militia, which is under the command, partially of Francis Nash, knowing that Richard Caswell was with the militia, and seeing that these people who in 75 are creating their own government, they're saying, okay, now's the time for our revolution. Now's the time to really upset the established order. This is the time when we're going to fight for our rights. The regulators who, in many cases, like watched friends die or shed blood at Alamance, they're going to look at that and say, how could we stand with them now when they didn't stand with us in 1771? Because the regulators were all about holding the elite to regulation, to some kind of responsibility to poor farmers and to the working many, as Herman Husband would refer to it. And if you're a regulator and you look and see these people leading the revolutionary government, you're saying, oh, it's going to be the same thing. They're just going to watch out for themselves. We're going to get screwed over. So yeah, why are we going to fight for them? And then also, if you are a regulator and you had been at Alamance, you can see the power of the state. The power that the government can bring to bear. And you're thinking, not just the volunteer militia of North Carolina. We're talking about the British Army now. So if you're making your bets, who are you going to bet on? So, part of it might have been wanting to send that message to the elite. And then part of it also might have been, the mental calculus of who you're going to support during the revolution. Now, we don't know a whole lot about, how people felt during that time. So they just didn't write those things down, or those documents haven't survived. But there was one quote from way after the war by one of these regulator loyalists, who we think might have been Jeremiah Field, who was one of the guys who was really involved in that riot in Hillsborough. So he's higher up in the regulator movement. And he, looking back at his time, he said, "I fought for my country, and I fought for my king, and I've been whipped twice."
Wow.
And that's it. They have a really rough go of things. The regulator loyalists do. There are regulators who, fight in the North Carolina militias, some that join up in the Continental Army, and do get involved in the revolution. But to go back to how you started this whole thing, Mark, this was very much more like a civil war, and you have allegiances that are split. And in backcountry North Carolina, when you've got split allegiances, when you've got, one side can't really exert a lot of power over the other, then you're just going to have very bitter fighting as each group tries to get over on the other.
So could you, for people who want to learn more about this battle, do you have recommended books? And then could you also tell us a little bit about, the park and what you guys do?
Yeah, totally. Yeah, so many recommended books. I would recommend Farming Dissenters by Carol Watterson Troxler. That is a great overall history of the regulator movement. And then there's another one called Breaking Loose Together by Marjolaine Kars. That focuses on some of the economic issues. It gives a lot of attention to the religious aspect of the regulators and those dissenting religions that they were a part of. And then if you want to learn a little bit more about Herman Husband, who is he's kind of a controversial figure, but he's a fascinating figure. There's a new book called Redemption from Tyranny, Herman Husband's American Revolution by Dr. Bruce Stewart. Highly recommend checking those out. And so I work at Alamance Battleground State Historic Site, interpreting the Battle of Alamance and life in the backcountry in the 18th century. We're located in Burlington, between Greensboro and Durham in North Carolina. And for our 250th event, we are going to mostly be virtual, which is good news. If you are in areas away from North Carolina, follow our Facebook page, Alamance Battleground State Historic Site, and we're going to have lots of videos, historical demonstrations, living history demonstrations. I've got a series of interviews with historians who have written about the regulation over the past 20 years. We're sort of catching up, talking about their work and about the legacies of the regulators. We also have some videos where we're going to have some people reading original documents from this time. I'm also rerunning something that I did last year that I was pretty proud of, where during the stay-at-home order, I took Tryon's orderly book and his campaign journal, and I followed the march from New Bern to Alamance Battleground, and then that punitive march through the backcountry went all the way around, and kind of followed everything to the day, and was able to sort of draw out the whole story of this campaign. So that's actually running right now on our Facebook page. And if you are local to the Burlington area, on the evening of May 15th, we are going to have a battlefield illumination. So we're going to have luminaries out on the grounds that are marking the positions of the regulators and of Tryon's militia. So it's a very different way of visualizing the battle. We will be able to visualize it in a way that really kind of shows the scope of it, the size of the battle in a way that even a reenactment can't. And we're going to have one lantern for every 10 people that were engaged at the battle, so a total of 300 in that illumination. And that's going to be the evening around dusk of Saturday, May 15th.
Okay, cool. And how big is the park site, and do you have the whole battlefield preserved? Are there any monuments or markers people can see when they go visit there?
Absolutely, yeah. We've got lots of wayside markers with good, new interpretation from the past 10 years. And then we're actually adding 3 more as part of our 250th between May and June. We're going to have 3 more additional ones that are added in. There are 2 monuments on the grounds. One was dedicated in 1880. And the other was dedicated in 1901 at Guilford Courthouse, and it was moved to Alamance Battleground. But both of those refer to Alamance Battleground as the first battle of the Revolution. So we use those to talk about memory and how local communities really desire to make their local history as superlative as possible. And the superlative that they tried to grasp onto was first battle of the Revolution. And it isn't exactly that. I would argue against that, but nothing takes place in a vacuum. And so this regulator movement was definitely of that revolutionary era. And it's interesting to see the ways in which there are interesting connections to the revolution, even if it's not first battle that leads to this bigger revolution.
Yeah, no, and I definitely encourage all of our viewers to definitely check out your series on following Tryon's movements, because you actually go to the different places and kind of show it from those places, which I think is fantastic. And I also heard you recently. I feel like a lot of people, at least for my wife, one of their first introductions to this entire story is through Outlander.
Oh yes. Do we have time to talk about Outlander? Yeah.
We got 5 minutes if you want
All
to
right,
talk a little bit about it.
Yeah. It's the classic double-edged sword, right? It's it's wishing on a monkey paw. I want to see the Battle of Alamance on a TV show. It was so cool to see this kind of obscure history on a TV show. And it's been interesting being a part of pop culture. I'm very thankful for it because it has put us on the radar of people who never would go to an 18th century battle site. And they come to see us and they come to tours, they do events. It's been really, really great. And the support that we've gotten from Outlander fans has been awesome. Now, in the TV show, I will say it's not a particularly accurate depiction of the battle. There are redcoats in there, so you got to get rid of those. But the landscape that they picked for the battle, it's a little bit more accurate than what our site looks like today. And also, they did a really cool thing where they used 18th century documentation as much as they could, including, in the scene where Governor Tryon is dictating his response to the regulators. That was William Tryon's response to the regulators from May 16th. And so it was really cool to hear that on the show.
Yeah, no, and I heard. I think the first time I heard your voice was I think you did a podcast for some Outlander fans that
Yes.
I thought you did a fantastic job of kind of doing a closer breakdown on what they saw on screen and what the actual history was. So, but yeah, no, that is kind of cool to see a part of that history on the big screen there.
I'm looking at our Facebook right now, and shout out to Beth Pittman. She was on. It was her podcast I was on, and then shout out to Don Powell, who is always a great commenter for us and has been a great supporter. So nice to see you watching.
That's
and,
great.
And
That's
thank
great.
you guys.
Well, cool. Yeah, no, thank you, Jeremiah, for talking about that. I think, with the 250th coming up, I know Emerging Revolutionary War, we plan on, I plan on trying to be down there for the Illuminary. So look forward to seeing the site. And yeah, it's tough during COVID. So glad you guys are finding ways to do a lot of digital stuff to reach out to more people. People are interested in some of the stuff we got coming up at Emerging Revolutionary War. We got in 3 weeks a virtual symposium that we're going to be holding in conjunction with Gatsby's Tavern in the city of Alexandria about hindsight is 2020, which we're doing in 2021. But you can find out information about that on our blog, emergingrevolutionarywar.org. And we're going to be doing a bus tour this November down up in Trenton and Princeton. So hopefully by then, much of the COVID restrictions will be let up by then. So check that out. You can find out information about that on our blog, on our website as well. So. But yeah, no, thank you, Jeremiah. Appreciate you coming on here talking to us about Alamance, and appreciate everybody for watching. And we'll be back in 2 weeks for another edition of Rev War Revelry. So thank you very much.
All right, thanks for having me on, Mark.